Masechet Baba Batra Daf Pe Gimel. We're discussing the law that if someone sells to someone else 2 trees, they only get the trees and not the land. But if he sells 3 trees, then that's already considered a whole group together, and he acquires the land also underneath. Now we ask a question about that. How much space must there be between the trees? If the trees are a mile apart, you're not going to call them a group. So what's the minimum and maximum? Rav Yosef Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shemuel Me'arba Amot ve'ad Shemoneh. We're going to see 2 opinions, both in the name of Shemuel. The first one is said by Rav Yosef in the name of Rav Yehuda, who was the student of Shemuel, and he said that the minimum is 4. If the trees are closer together than that, 1, 2, 3 amot apart, and that's too dense, and therefore they're not going to grow well because they're all sharing from the same resources underground. The roots are all entangled, and the farmer is going to end up uprooting at least one of them to make more space. So that's considered too dense and not an orchard, not a group of trees. And the maximum is 8 amot. If it's 8 amot or more, each tree is far from each other, then that's also not considered a group. That's the first opinion. Rava Amar Rav Nachman Amar Shemuel Mishemoneh ve'ad shesh esreh. Rava, in the name of Rav Nachman, also said in the name of Shemuel that the minimum is 8 and the maximum is 16, double of the numbers of the first opinion. Amar le Abaye le Rav Yosef latiflog ale de Rav Nachman ditnan matnitin kevateh. So now we're going to have some discussion and proofs and challenges to each of these opinions. So Abaye says to Rav Yosef, do not disagree with Rav Nachman, because there is a Mishnah that proves the opinion of Rav Nachman, who said 16 amot is the top amount. So therefore, Rav Yosef, you should agree with Rav Nachman. What is this Mishnah? It's Mishnah in Masechet Kilayim, Ditnan, Hanoteh et karmo shesh esrei ama, al shesh esrei ama, mutar lehavi zera lesham. The law regarding Kilayim is that you cannot have a vine and plant a wheat or other types of vegetables next to it. Now, if you have just one vine, then you have to distance the wheat 1 amah. That's it, just 1 amah. But if you have a vineyard, then you have to distance the wheat 4 amot away from the outskirts of the vineyard. So, what defines what is just a single one and what becomes a vineyard? 2, 3, how many? How close together? So, we're going to compare the laws of Kilayim to the laws here of buying trees and assume that it's the same principles. So, the Mishnah Kilayim says, if someone plants his vineyard 16 by 16, meaning there's many rows, and each row is at least 16 apart, 16 or more, like over here, you plant here, move 16, and plant another row of vines here, and another row of vines 16 amot away. As long as it's 16 or more, one is permitted to bring other seeds in between and plant them. So we see, that's it. The maximum is 16. Once it's 16 or more, it's not considered a group, not for kilayim and also not for the trees. And in fact, this opinion of Tanakama is backed up by a story. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Do not confuse this Rabbi Yehuda, who's a 4th generation Tana. Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai, student of Rabbi Akiba. He is mentioned, he is quoted here in the Mishnah, and he has the opposite view of Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda is the Amorah, 2nd generation Amorah, student of Shemuel. He's the one that says 4 to 8. So Rav is going to be the Amorah, Rabbi is the Tana, and he relates the following story. Maaseh besamon be'echad shenata et karmo shesh esrei al shesh esrei ama. והיה הופך שיער 2 שורות לצד אחד וזורע את הניר. לשנה אחרת היה הופך את השיער למקום הזרע וזרע את הבור. ובמעשה לפני חכמים והתירוהו. One time there was a story that happened in a city called Salmon. someone planted a vineyard 16 by 16, meaning rows of vines 16 amot away from each other, and he would turn all of the branches towards one side, and he would sow the empty space in between. And then the next year, he would turn the branches the other way and sow the place that he left fallow the year before. In other words, the first year, he would take all the he would plant them always in the same place. But it doesn't matter where the roots are when you're counting the 16 amot of the vines. It's not from the roots to the roots, but rather you include the branches also. So the first year, he would have this row face right, and the next row face left. So this whole part is all a vineyard. But the next part, since there's nothing here and it's 16 amot, so he was able to plant wheat and other stuff here. And the next year, since he wanted to rotate the land and since this rested, and now he wants to let this part rest, so the next year he goes over here and he covers this up, and he then plants over here. And the case came before the Chachamim, and they said it's permitted. Why is it permitted? Because it's 16 amot away from each other in that area, and therefore that's not a vineyard. That's just empty space. So we see that the Mishnah supports the opinion of Rav Nachman, and Abaye tells Rav Yosef, hey, you really should follow Rav Nachman. Why are you saying 8 amot when it's cleared from this Mishnah that it's 16? But Rav Yosef has a defense as well. Amar le, ana la yada'na, ela obada have. Listen, I don't know about your source. All I know, obviously he knows the Mishnah, but he's saying, I understand your source, you have a proof, but I have a story also. And the following case came, Bedura dera avata, in a place called the village of shepherds. Vatula kamed Rav Yehuda v'amar le, zil hable kimlo bakar vechelav. It was some person who bought 3 trees, and he wanted to know, do I get the land also in between the trees? And the case came to Rav Yehuda, and Rav Yehuda says, yes, you get the land. How much? The land sufficient for an ox and its vessels. In other words, between the trees, the amount that you can the ox can go and pull a plow or a wagon, whatever it's pulling. That's how much you have. But Rav Yosef says, I didn't know how much that is. How much is that space? 5 feet, 10 feet? כיוון דשמעתה להדתנן, לא ייטע אדם אילן סמוך לשדה חברו, אלא אם כן הרחיק ממנה 4 אמות, ותענה עלה 4 אמות שאמרו כדי עבודת הכרם. אמינה שמאמינה, כמלוא בקר וחלב 4 אמות. However, so I didn't know how much this was. However, then I heard this following Mishnah with a Baraita commentary on it. The Mishnah says a person may not plant a tree next to his friend's field because it will cause damage to his field. But he has to move the tree away for 4 amot. The Baraita says these 4 amot. Why 4 amot? It's enough space to work the vineyard. You need some working space. What does that mean, working space for the vineyard? Oh, I said it must be working space for an ox to move with his plow or with his wagon, and that is 4 amot. So there you go. Now I know from comparing this Baraita that mentions avodat hakerem, working, well, that's obviously with an ox, and the Mishnah that says 4 amot, now I know that's the same amount. And so now, when I go back over here, and Rav Yehuda said, give him enough for the ox to go with his vessels, Rav Yehuda meant 4 amot. So obviously, in that case, the trees were 4 amot away from each other, and he says, yes, you get the land. And that's my proof that the minimum is 4. So that I have a source as well. Good. Now, Rav Yosef mi la tenan. Now we ask, hold on, Rav Yosef actually has a Mishnah. He doesn't have to rely only on the story of Rav Yehuda. That actually the story only said something about 4, not even about 8. We actually have a Mishnah. It's not a surprise Mishnah. It's the same Mishnah we just quoted, Kilayim 4:9. It's the continuation. We saw Tanakama and the story of Rabbi Yehuda that both said 16. But now we see there's other opinions. Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon omerim, hanote et kalmo shemone amot al shemone mutar lehabi zera lesham. Both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon say that if someone plants a vineyard and each row is 8 amot away, then he's allowed to bring other species and plant them in the middle. So you see, this Mishnah has two Tanaim that says the maximum is 8, and that was Rav Yosef's opinion also in the name of Rav Yehuda, in the name of Shemuel. So he has a perfectly good Mishnah. So now the question is, how come Abaye challenged Rav Yosef and said, oh, don't say 4 to 8, you should say like Rav Nachman, because look, there's a Mishnah like him. Why did Abaye say that? After all, the very same Mishnah also has another opinion that says 4 to 8. So why choose Rabbi Yehuda in his story over Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon? What was Abaye thinking? And the answer is, Afilu hachi maaseh adif. Even though you're right, in the very same Mishnah, you have this other opinion, but a story is preferable. Whenever the Mishnah brings a story, which is rare, usually it just says, okay, here's these 2 opinions or 3 opinions. But if one of the opinions has a story to back it up, this actually happened, and the case came to the rabbis, and the rabbi said this and that, then that gives that opinion more authority. And that's why Abaye said, Rav Yosef, look, there's a Mishnah, and the Mishnah has a story. The Yehuda says 16, so you should really say 16 as well. Okay, anyway, Rav Yosef didn't. He also has his source. He has the story of Rav Yehuda, and he has these opinions, and so the machloket stands. Now, we want to clarify the sources for both the minimum and the maximum according to both opinions. Bishlama le Rav Yosef alibad Rabbi Shimon. Rav Yosef, who follows Rabbi Shimon, he actually follows Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon, but we're going to quote Rabbi Shimon only in a second, so we're focusing on him. Shaminan le mefuzarim v'shaminan le resufin. We have for Rav Yosef both a source for the distance of when it's too scattered and when it's too close together, meaning the maximum and the minimum. What are they? Mefuzarin had amaran. The most maximum, the 8, we have in the source that we just quoted. It says here 8. So that's how he knows. Rav Yosef follows Rabbi Shimon that the maximum is 8. Mefuzarin hadamaran. Risufin ditnan. How about the 4? What's the source for that? I know we saw the story of Rav Yehuda, but we want a source from a Tana. Ditnan. Kerem hanatua al pachot me'arba amot eno kerem. Divrei Rabbi Shimon. Hachamim omerim kerem vero'in et ha'emsayim ki'ilu enan. If you have a vineyard that is planted closer than 4 amot, each of the vines is 2 or 3 amot away from each other, Rabbi Shimon says that's not called a vineyard because it's too close together. It's not going to last like that. You're going to end up having to pull them out, and so that's not called a vineyard. That's just a mess. And so you see, that's 4 amot is the minimum. That's the source for the Shimon. Now we happen to have another opinion there that's not relevant to our opinions up here. Hachamim say it is a vineyard because we consider the middle ones as if they don't exist. Since the farmer is going to end up uprooting them, we consider them as if they're uprooted already from now, and therefore we say, okay, so it's fine. But anyway, the point is, Rabbi Shimon says the minimum is 4. We said before the maximum is 8, and there you go. Rav Yosef has a source in Rabbi Shimon both for the maximum and the minimum. Ela Rav Nachman alibad Rabbanan mefuzarin shaminan le resufin mi shaminan le. But Rav Nachman, who follows Rabbanan, he follows that Tanakama with the story of Rabbi Yehuda back in that Mishnah. So that was the maximum. It mentioned 16, but the minimum of how much is too dense. Does Rav Nachman have a source to say that it's 8? He said a source for 16, but what's his source for the minimum of 8? It's not in the Mishnah. And the answer is, Sevarahu midil bishimon palga, Rabbanan nami palga. The answer is that it's logic. Just like for Rabbi Shimon, the minimum is half of the maximum. The maximum is 8, the minimum is 4. So too, it makes sense. It's not a proof, but it seems reasonable, plausible, that for Rabbanan, where we have a source that the maximum is 16, so what would he say about the minimum? It's probably just the same ratio, and the minimum would be 8. And that's the source for Rava in the name of Rav Nachman, that it's 8 to 16. Amar Rava. So now Rava says, what's the halacha going to be? Are we going to follow Rav Yehuda 4 to 8 or Rav Nachman 8 to 16? He says something surprising. Hilcheta me'arba amot ve'ad shesh esrei. Rava says the halacha is the minimum is 4 and the maximum is 16. Now, this is quite surprising because he's not following consistently either Rav Yehuda or Rav Nachman, but rather a combination of both. He's taking the minimum of Rav Yehuda 4 and the maximum of Rav Nachman, which is 16. So why is he not being consistent? Apparently, he disagrees with the logic that we said over here, that just because you follow Rav Nachman, who says 16, and Rav Nachman has a good source. It's the Mishnah, Tanakama of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda about the story of Salmon. So that's pretty strong evidence that the halacha of maximum should be 16. But who says that the minimum has to be half? We have, on the other hand, the story of Rav Yehuda, the Amora, where that was 4. So Rava says, I'm going to take the story of Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah and the story of Rav Yehuda, the Amora, and therefore say the maximum is 16 and the minimum is 4. And it's not necessary for the ratio to be 1/2. So Rava makes a lot of sense, and furthermore, he has a braita to back him up. Tanya kevate de Rava, kama yehu mekoravin 4 amot, vechama yehu meruchakin 16. Braita says, how close do they have to be so that it's considered a grouping? 4 amot. And how far do they have to be? Meaning, and more than that, it would be considered too far away. 16. Hareze kana karka ve'ta'ilanot shebenehen. The Braita continues and explains, as long as the 3 trees that the person is buying are between 4 and 16 amot away from each other, the buyer acquires the land and any small trees that happen to be in between. Lefichach yavash ha'ilan oniksas yesh lo karka. Therefore, if the trees that he bought should dry up and get cut down, so he owns the land and he can plant new trees. He owns the land. פחות מכאן או יותר על כאן, או שלקחן בזה אחר זה, הרי זה לא קנה לא את הקרקע ולא את האילנות שביניהן, לפיכך יבש האילן או נקסס, אין לו קרקע. But if the trees are less than 4 amot away from each other, that's too dense. Or if they're more than 16 amot away from each other, that's too far away. Or even if the trees are in that ratio, but he bought one at a time. He bought this tree now, and the second tree tomorrow, and the third tree the next day. So since he didn't buy them together, they don't form a group. In any of those cases, he does not acquire the land, nor does he acquire the small trees in between. Therefore, once the tree dries up and dies, or if it's cut down, he does not own the land and he cannot replant them. He only owns the trees themselves for as long as they are there. Next, Ba'e Rabbi Irmiyah. Keshu moded, memakom kasar hu moded, or memakom rachav hu moded. Rabbi Irmiyah is asking, as he often does, a very technical, detailed question. When you measure from one tree to another, are you going to measure from the narrow part of the tree or from the wide part of the tree? It can make a difference of several inches, and that'll make the difference between whether it's more or less than these cutoff points. אמר לרב גביהה מבית קטיר לרב אשר, תשמע דתנן, הרחובה שבגפן אינו מודד אלא מעיקר השני. So we have an answer from Rav Geviha from this place, Bet Katir. He told Rav Asher that we can learn this from a Mishnah in Kilayim. We're learning a lot of Mishnayot in Kilayim today, that if you layer a branch, that is, you take a branch of a vine and you dig it down, you move it, you pull it, and you dig it down under the ground in the hopes that it will take root itself when it's in the ground. It's still connected to the original vine, but now you're going to make a new vine that, while it's connected, it'll take root and then it'll sprout forth a new vine, even though it's actually also connected to the old one. And you can do that multiple times. That was one of the ways to extend a vine. And so when you do this, now you have 2 vines that they are connected to each other, but the new one also took root. And you want to decide how to measure between them to see how much space there is. You should measure from the second knot. There's different levels, different branches. In other words, not the bottom, that's the thickest, not the top, that's the skinniest, but rather the middle, that's intermediate. And so that's the answer. That's where you would measure from, not the biggest and not the smallest, but rather the medium part of the branch. Another question by Rabbi Yirmiyah. Machar lo shelosha badei ilan mahu. If someone sells 3 branches from the same tree. In other words, you have one tree and it has branches, but the bottoms of those branches are covered up by dirt, and so from the top it looks like they might be three separate trees, but you know that they actually are all connected to one trunk. So what do you say? Are they considered like three trees, and therefore the buyer would get all the land in between also? Or is it basically one tree because it's all connected to one root? Good question. Amar le Rav Geviha mi bekatir le Rav Asher, answered also by Rav Geviha to Rav Asher Tashema Ditnan Hamavrich Shalosh Kefanim ve'ikarehen nid'in Rabbi Elazar beRabbi Sadok Omer Im yesh benehen me'arba amot ve'ad shemone mistarfin ve'im lav en mistarfin. The Mishnah again in Kilayim says if someone layers three vines, and we take one vine and you layer it, and then you layer it again, and it grows three vines, and you can see the roots. In other words, you can see that each one of the new ones took root. So now they are connected to the previous one, but they are also independently viable because they have their own roots. In such a case, Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Sadok, says if there is at least 4 amot between them, minimum or maximum 8 amot, then they can join together. This opinion says between 4 and 8, and if not, they do not join together. So what we see is that we consider them to be 3 separate trees, and if they are in the right ratio, then the buyer will acquire the land that's in between. Next, we have a series of more questions and of clarification by different Amoraim. Ba'e Rav Papa. Machar lo shenaim betoch sadeo ve'echad al hameser mahu. What if someone sells to someone else 2 trees that are in his field, but one that's on the border? Do those 3 join together? Assuming they're also in the proper ratio, distance from each other, but one of them is on the border, so maybe that's considered a separate spot and does not join with the other 2. Or maybe it doesn't matter and it does join. Another question, shenaim betoch shelo ve'echad betoch shel chavero mai. If you would say that you do count the border, what if 2 of them are in his own field and he also sells another tree that's in a different field, a field that belongs to somebody else? And so like he puts together a package deal where he gets 2 trees from this guy and 1 tree from the other guy. So do those 3 join together, assuming they are of the right distance from each other, and he'll acquire the land that's in between them and any other small trees and bushes that are in between? Does he acquire them? Or do you say, no, since they're owned by different people, they do not join together? What's the answer? Teko, we leave this standing, and we for further discussion. Ba'erav Asher bor mahu shetafsik amatamai mahu shetafsik reshut rabim mahu richbad dikle mahu teko. Rav Asher asks, what if between the 3 trees there's a pit, or what if there's a water stream or an aqueduct? Will that separate between the trees on this side and that side, and therefore the buyer does not get what's in between? Or it's okay, it doesn't separate? Or what if there's a main thoroughfare, people walking through, and he buys 1 tree on this side and 2 trees on the other side? And finally, what if there's a row of palm trees? Now you'll ask, well, the palm trees are there, don't they act as trees by themselves? And so they will join in, and now there's more trees, and we'll have to look at the distances between them. So the answer is we're talking about a case where the palm trees are owned by somebody else, or he specifically excludes the palm trees. He says, I'm buying these other 3 trees, and they are close enough to make a group. Do we consider the palm trees that are in the middle to be a divider or not? We leave these questions standing. Be'amine Hillel me'Rabbi. Hillel, this is not Hillel Hazaken, who lived way before Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, but rather the Amora that's usually known as Rabbi Hillel, a grandson of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, asks, Allah eres benehen mahu. What if there's a cedar tree that grew between the 3 trees that the guy bought? Does the cedar tree make a division and now they're not considered a grouping, or can we ignore the cedar tree? First, we clarify the question. Allah, did it grow now? Meaning, first he bought the 3 trees and then it grew after. Well, if it grew after he already bought it, then it grew in his in his domain. I bought 3 trees, so I get all the land in between. So any in the future that happens, a cedar tree grows, of course the buyer gets it. So it doesn't mean, when he says Allah, it doesn't mean that it grew afterwards. Rather, what he meant in the question, must have meant in the question, is that there was a cedar tree there at the time of the sale. We said that any small bushes, they're not so significant. So they come along and he buys the land and he gets those bushes also. But this eres, do you say, oh, this is a significant thing and therefore it divides all the others? Or do you say, well, it's different. The 3 trees that he's buying are fruit trees. And this is different from the rest. And so it's not significant. And the answer is, Amale kana vekana. The B says, yes, he acquires the cedar trees among them, even though it's big. It's not the same as a bush, but nevertheless, he says, I'm buying these 3 fruit trees, and everything else in between comes along for the ride, and we do not consider the cedar tree to be its own entity that will divide between the others. Kesad hen omdin. Now, when we say these 3 trees form a group, what is their configuration, right? What shape should they be in? Rav Amar Keshura, Ushmuel Amar Kahasuba. Rav says in a row, 1, 2, 3, right in a row, where Shmuel says it's like a tripod. Here's a Greek tripod vessel. So this is like a pot that rests on 3 legs. So the point is that it's a triangle on the ground. That's what it means. When it's in that configuration, then it's considered a group. Now, would they agree with the others' opinion? Ravu says that 3 in a row is considered a group. All the more so if it's in a triangle, it's considered a group, because a triangle looks more connected to each other than a row. However, the opinion that says a triangle is considered a group, but if it's a row, not so. Then a row, according to Shemuel, if they're 3 in a row, they do not join together. He only gets the trees, even 3, and not the land. What's the reason? Because when they're in a row, it's easy to sow seeds in between. Right? You have 3 trees in a row, and so it's easy in between to put some plants in over here and grow some wheat in between, and it's easy to do because just going straight through the trees that are in a row. But when it's a triangle, then it's difficult to do because there's no one straight line that you can go to, because then you're going to be blocked by the 3rd one. And so since you can't plant anything in between the triangle, therefore it's considered its own domain. So it makes more sense that you get the land in between when it's a triangle. Triangle kind of blocks out everything that's around it, whereas a straight line does not block out because you can still go straight through and plant other things there. So the seller wants to keep it when it's in a row, but there's no point in keeping the land between a triangle, and that explains why, according to Shemuel, only if it's a triangle, then that's considered a group, but not if it's in a row. Challenge to that, Matkif la Rav Hamnuna. Ulman damar kachasuva, mai tama de la mizdara ben taihu. Rav Hamnuna asks, according to Shemuel, that says it has to be a triangle, what's the reason? Because a triangle, you can't sow between the trees, and that's why it's considered a group, and the buyer gets all the land. So according to that, let's say the seller sells 3 thorny shrubs. They're very thorny, and even if they're in a straight line, you can't sow between them because when you go through, you'll get all plucked by the thorns. So would Shemuel agree in that case that he gets the land in between because it's not convenient to go through and sow in between? Amaleh hanach lachashibi hanach chashibi. And the answer to Rav Hamnuna was, no, these Roman shrubs are not significant. And so if you sell even a lot of shrubs, you don't get the land in between, because it's only if it's a tree. Oh, the tree is a significant thing. Together with 2 other trees, these form a whole unit, and you get you get all the land in between. But these little shrubs are not significant, and therefore they don't form a group, and you wouldn't get anything in between anyway. It doesn't matter what form, even if they were in a triangle, you wouldn't get the one things in between, and so therefore we can dismiss and answer Rav Hamnuna's challenge. Let's finish off with the next Mishnah. Hamocher rosh behema gasa lo machar et haraglayim. Machar et haraglayim lo machar et harosh. If someone sells the head of a big animal, we're talking about like a cow or an ox, then the legs are not included. The idea is that when it comes to a big animal, each of the parts are significant in and of themselves. So if the butcher says, I'm going to sell you the head, the legs are not included. And the other way around. If he says, I'm going to sell you the legs, then the head is not included, because both have a lot of meat on it, both are significant. And if the butcher says, I'm going to sell you the windpipe, but that's with the lungs together with it, they would eat everything back then, or put into a soup, whatever they did with it. That's a significant part. And the liver, you cannot assume comes along with it, because the liver is its own important part. And if he says, I'm going to sell you the liver, then he doesn't get the windpipe and the lungs. Every part of a big animal is its own separate identity. Aval b'daka, machar et harosh, machar et haraglayim. Machar et haraglayim, lo machar et harosh. But when it comes to a small animal, like a lamb or a goat, then if the butcher says, I'll sell you the head, then the legs come along with it. The legs are scrawny, and so generally they're not sold independently. They're not so important. Rather, when the butcher says, I'll sell you the head is the main thing, and you get the forelegs along with it. Whereas if he says, I'm going to sell you the forelegs, that does not come with the head, because the head, even of a sheep, is significant, has a lot of nice meat on it to eat, and so that is not included in the legs. Machar et hakaneh, machar et hakabed, machar et hakabed, lo machar et hakaneh. If the butcher says, I'm going to sell you the windpipe, that's the lungs also, of a small animal, the liver comes along with it, because the liver is pretty insignificant and usually is sold together. But if he says, I'm going to sell you the liver, then the buyer only gets the liver and does not get the more significant windpipe and lungs. Arba midot b'mochrin. And now we learn about 4 rules that apply to different sellers and buyers. We're going to see 4 categories. In some cases, when a different thing is delivered than what was promised, that's what it has to do with the top here. The butcher said, I'm going to sell you one thing, and then the buyer says, no, I want the other thing. So in cases like that, in some cases, the buyer can renege, in some cases, the seller can renege, in some both, and some neither can. So we'll see examples of each of these. If the seller says, I'm going to give you high quality wheat, but in the end he delivers low quality wheat, then only the buyer can return it and said, you told me high quality, this is low quality, and the seller cannot do so, because the seller is giving him the seller said, I'm giving you high quality, and cannot take it back, but the buyer, who's the one that's getting gypped, he can go back on it and say, I want to return. If the seller says, I'm going to give you bad quality, it's cheap, but I'm going to give you bad quality wheat, and he ends up giving him high quality wheat, the seller can come back and say, I gave you the wrong thing, and you only paid for low quality. I gave you the wrong thing. I want the merchandise back. I'll give you your money back. And in that case, only the seller can renege. He's the one that's getting cheated, and not the buyer. If he got what was promised, either that the seller said, I'm going to give you low quality wheat, and that's what he delivered, or if he said, I'm going to give you high quality wheat, and that is what he delivered, then neither of them can go back on the deal. That's it. The deal's final. You got exactly what you were promised. And so there's no reason for either party to be able to change their minds. They might want to, because let's say the price changed in between. So he says, the price just went up. Okay, I want that back because I can sell it for more. No, you made the deal. That's it. You can't change. You can't renege on the deal because it was delivered as promised. Shechamtit v'nimset lebanav v'nimset shechamtit. Now we're going to talk about cases where he delivered the wrong thing, but it's not better or worse. It's just different. So if he says, I'm going to sell you reddish wheat, and it turns out he delivered white wheat, or he said, I'm going to deliver white, it turns out to be reddish wheat. Both are good. It depends on the recipe. Sometimes people like the red, sometimes people like the white. So these are all cases where either party can change their minds because it's not the same thing that was promised. If I said, I'm going to sell you olive wood, turns out I delivered sycamore, or I promised sycamore, turns out to be olive. Both of them are good. Olive wood is very good for burning. Sycamore is very strong, good for building. They're good for different things. You might just say, oh, that's not what I need. I want to return it. Or I might give you something that says, oh, I delivered a different thing. I want that merchandise because I need it for something else. So either party can change their minds. Yain v'nimsa chomes, chomes v'nimsa yain, shenehem yecholim lachazor behen. Or if he promised wine and he delivered vinegar, or the other way around, he promised vinegar and he delivered wine, both of them can change their mind because vinegar also has good uses. You want to make a salad dressing. I don't want to make it with wine. I want to make it with vinegar. And so in these cases, since it's just a different item, either party can change and say, you delivered the wrong thing, or I delivered to you the wrong thing, and renege on the deal and return the merchandise. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.